What would you do if the very person who gave you life became the one who tried to destroy it? My story isn't about a toxic stranger or a cruel boss. It's about my own mother, a woman who, instead of love, handed me betrayal, instead of guidance, handed me chaos. When I was just 4 years old, because of her recklessness, I lost sight in one of my eyes. And you'd think that would break her, but no. She laughed. She blamed everyone else. She made herself the victim. And that was just the beginning. For years, she manipulated, lied, stole, and even tried to rip away the life I built for my own child. She thought she could keep winning, until I finally turned every scar she gave me into my weapon. This isn't just a story of pain. It's the story of revenge. And if you've ever dreamed of seeing karma catch up with someone who thought they were untouchable, stick around. Hit that like button, subscribe, and get ready. Because this is the day my mother learned what real consequences feel like. You know how most kids look at their mother like she's their safe place? Like no matter what happens out in the world, she's the one who's supposed to keep you safe, protect you, and nurture you? Yeah. I never had that. From the very beginning, my mother was a liar. Not just the small, white lies that people use to soften reality, no. I'm talking about a woman who weaponized lying. It was her shield, her sword, her identity. If something went wrong, she never, ever took accountability. She'd laugh it off, point the finger at someone else, or twist the story so much that suddenly she was the victim. And me? I grew up learning that the person who brought me into this world was also the first person to betray me. I still remember being 4 years old, just a baby, really, when one of her reckless choices cost me the sight in my right eye. I can't even describe the fear of suddenly realizing part of your vision is gone, and worse than that, realizing it was because of the very person who was supposed to love you unconditionally. Did she hold me, comfort me, or even apologize? No. She shrugged. She laughed. She blamed it on fate, or on me being clumsy, or on circumstances outside her control. Anything but herself. That's when I first learned, in her world, she is never wrong. And as I grew up, I noticed this pattern everywhere. She would pick fights with service workers, scream at cashiers, belittle waiters. She strutted around like she was wealthy, even though she never worked a day in her life. She lived on my father's income, burning through it recklessly on shopping, drinking, and whatever nonsense made her feel glamorous for 5 minutes. And every time money ran short, she'd cry victim again. She'd call relatives for help, or guilt-trip neighbors, or manipulate family friends into lending her something. But here's the kicker, she never used that money for stability. Rent, bills, savings? Forget it. She'd blow it all on herself. Every single time. Now, while she drowned herself in shallow pleasures, I grew up on the opposite side of that coin. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was rebellion. But something inside me decided, I will never be like her. So I worked. I studied. I learned early on that if I wanted something, I'd have to earn it with my own 2 hands. And when life knocked me down, I didn't whine. I didn't look for someone to blame. I got back up. Stronger. Smarter. More determined. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was brutal. Imagine being a kid and having your own mother unload her emotional baggage on you. She'd cry at me when I was barely a teenager, dumping her problems on my shoulders like I was some kind of therapist or husband. She wanted me to fix her life when she couldn't even take responsibility for brushing her own teeth some days. That does things to a kid. It hardens you. Makes you older than your years. But it also gave me a strange gift. I developed a kind of resilience most people don't understand. While other kids were still figuring out how to ask for allowance, I was figuring out how to budget, how to work small jobs, how to handle people who wanted to break me. Fast forward to adulthood. By then, I had built a life defined by independence. I refused to ask for emotional or financial support. I ran my own business, made my own choices, and carried myself with a sense of accountability my mother couldn't even spell. But here's the problem with toxic people: they don't just vanish when you become an adult. They slither back in whenever they see a crack they can exploit. And my mother? She saw the biggest crack of all when my child was born. Becoming a parent is supposed to be this beautiful, grounding experience. You hold your baby for the first time and suddenly the world shifts: your priorities, your fears, your hopes, everything. I wanted to give my child the one thing I never had: a safe home. A home filled with love, stability, and honesty. But my mother had other plans. See, when my father retired, her financial cushion started shrinking. Suddenly, the endless shopping trips and careless spending weren't so easy to cover. And instead of adjusting like a normal adult, budgeting, cutting down on luxuries, she panicked. She saw my new family as an opportunity. She convinced me, and this is still hard to admit, that moving into their unit would be the best thing for us. She played the role of the supportive grandmother, promising that it would be easier, safer, more affordable. She even talked to my landlord behind my back, manipulating him into evicting me. She presented it like a gift: come live here, pay us rent, we'll help with the baby. But once I moved in, the mask came off. It became painfully clear that this wasn't about helping me, it was about control. They pressured me to give up my business, the very income stream that kept me independent. They claimed I didn't have enough savings to afford a nanny and tried to force me into being financially dependent on them. They even locked away my belongings in a storage unit inside their apartment, then started gatekeeping access to it like it was some kind of power play. Do you know how humiliating it feels to knock on the door of your own parents, asking permission to access your own stuff? To be treated like a child, when in reality you're the only adult in the room? And as if that wasn't enough, my mother, in true form, began her smear campaign. She whispered to neighbors about how much the baby cried, convincing them to file joint complaints. She painted me as this irresponsible, incapable parent. But when authorities checked, guess what? They found a perfectly healthy, well-cared-for child. Her plan backfired. Still, she didn't stop. Because for her, this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dominance. She wanted to break me. But here's the part she underestimated. I had spent my entire life being forged in the fire of her toxicity. I knew her games better than anyone. I knew how she lied, how she manipulated, how she turned people against each other. And this time, I wasn't going to let her win. Because while she was busy spreading lies and throwing tantrums, I was preparing something else, something she didn't see coming. A plan. A way to turn all her schemes against her. And trust me, when the tables finally turned, the look on her face was priceless. Living under my parents' roof after my child was born wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a calculated trap. At first, I tried to brush things off. I told myself, they're my parents. Maybe they just don't know how to help. Maybe they're awkward grandparents trying too hard. But no, this wasn't ignorance. This was intentional sabotage. Let's start with my business. I'd worked for years to build something of my own. Late nights, early mornings, sacrifices most people wouldn't even notice, all to make sure I never had to depend on anyone the way my mother depended on my father. But she couldn't stand that. She would tell me, running your own business is unstable. You should quit and let us handle things. Notice that word? Us. Not me. Not my family. Them. Behind the scenes, she was whispering to relatives and neighbors that I was reckless, that I was wasting my time chasing dreams that would never work. She even went as far as trying to convince some of my contacts that I wasn't reliable. Can you imagine? Your own mother trying to undercut your clients. At first, I thought maybe I was paranoid. But when I confronted a friend who had stopped returning my calls, they admitted, your mom told us you're overwhelmed. That you're closing up anyway. My blood boiled. She wasn't just trying to control me financially. She was actively trying to erase the one thing that kept me independent. And then came the storage unit. she had convinced me to keep many of my belongings in a space within her apartment. She pitched it as easier, no need for an external storage rental, she said. It would be safe with her, she said. Biggest mistake of my life. Because suddenly, it wasn't storage anymore. It was leverage. Anytime I needed something, a box, an old file, baby items, I had to ask permission. Like some teenager begging for allowance. Sometimes she'd ignore me. Other times she'd say, "You should have asked earlier." One time, I gave her 12 hours notice that I needed to get some things. No reply. When I showed up, she refused to let me in. My belongings. My property. Held hostage in my own mother's house. And the worst part? She enjoyed it. I could see it in her smirk. This wasn't about logistics. It was about power. Then she crossed the line from manipulation into outright cruelty. My baby developed a rash. Nothing alarming, the kind of thing every infant goes through. But my mother saw an opportunity. She called Child Protective Services on me. Let me repeat that. My own mother called CPS on me. She painted this picture of me as a neglectful parent, of my child as some poor victim. And when they showed up at my door, my heart sank into my stomach. Because even though I knew I had nothing to hide, the very idea that someone could try to take my child away was terrifying. But when the caseworker looked around, when they saw my child, healthy, happy, well cared for, the truth was obvious. The complaint was baseless. The case was dropped almost instantly. Still, do you know how it feels to realize that your own mother would rather weaponize the system against you than take responsibility for anything herself? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to my baby breathe, and I realized, this wasn't just toxic. This was war. But she wasn't finished. When her tactics didn't work, she called in reinforcements. Extended family members started reaching out of nowhere. At first, they acted concerned. How are you holding up? Is everything okay with the baby? But their questions weren't normal. They were targeted. Probing. And soon, I realized why. My mother had sent them. She wanted updates. Reports. She wanted them to act as her little spies, feeding her information about my mood, my plans, my words. This wasn't new, either. Growing up, I remembered how she'd do the same thing with romantic partners. She'd hold these little secret meetings, charming them into telling her everything I said or did. Then she'd twist that information into ways to control me. Now she was doing it again, except this time, the stakes were higher. She wasn't just trying to control me. She was trying to control how I raised my child. And where was my father in all of this? Silent. Always silent. He had been the enabler for years, the steady paycheck, the buffer that made her chaos livable. And now, in retirement, he was too tired, too beaten down to stand up to her. Sometimes he'd give me this look, half apologetic, half defeated, like he knew she was wrong but couldn't bring himself to stop her. And in some ways, that was almost worse. Because silence in the face of abuse isn't neutral. It's complicity. All of this, the business sabotage, the storage power play, the CPS call, the family spies, the father's silence, it built up inside me like pressure in a boiler. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and demand, why? Why would you do this to your own child? But deep down, I already knew the answer. Because in her world, everything was about her. She couldn't handle the idea of me being independent. She couldn't stand watching me succeed where she had failed. She couldn't stomach the fact that I was building a healthy life for my child while hers was crumbling. And so, she tried to drag me down. But here's the thing about pressure, when it builds long enough, it doesn't just crush you. Sometimes, it forges you. And that's exactly what happened. One night, after yet another screaming match where she threatened to call the police if I didn't leave her unit, I sat alone in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding, my vision blurred with rage and exhaustion. And that's when it hit me. I can't keep playing defense. All my life, I had been reacting to her chaos. Trying to contain it. Trying to survive it. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Not for me. Not for my child. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time to make her feel, really feel, the consequences she had spent her whole life dodging. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. About teaching her that no, she couldn't manipulate and lie her way out of everything. Not anymore. And as that realization sank in, something inside me shifted. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. All that was left was resolve. Pause. Narrator tone darkens, pulling audience in closer. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could evict me, sabotage me, and humiliate me with no repercussions. But she was about to learn the hard way: when you push someone too far, when you back them into a corner and threaten what they love most, you create something dangerous. You create someone who has nothing left to lose. And that's when I began planning her downfall. When I finally decided enough was enough, the very first thing I did was something my mother had never done in her entire life. I thought ahead. See, she thrived on chaos. Screaming fits. Sudden manipulations. Emotional outbursts that caught everyone off guard. But me? I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum. I was going to build something so airtight, so deliberate, that by the time she realized what I was doing, it would be too late. The eviction. That was her big move. She had gone behind my back to my landlord, whispered poison into his ear, and gotten me kicked out. And for what? So she could force me into her unit, into her control. But she made a mistake. A legal mistake. The eviction had violated contract law, and I had the paperwork to prove it. So I did what she never expected: I filed a pre-lawsuit complaint. When she first got wind of it, I could see the panic flicker across her face. She tried to play it off, of course. Oh, don't be ridiculous, lawsuits cost money. You wouldn't actually go through with this. But I didn't need to go through with it. The simple act of filing was enough to make the walls of her fake empire start crumbling. Suddenly, she wasn't so quick to scream in my face. Suddenly, she and my father didn't want to talk to me. Translation: she was scared. Because for the first time, someone was holding her accountable. The second step of my plan was quieter. More patient. I cut off her fuel. Remember, people like my mother survive on two things: attention and money. She needed constant drama to keep herself entertained, and she needed financial resources to prop up her fake rich lifestyle. So I starved her. I stopped engaging in fights. No yelling back, no defending myself against her lies. Just silence. Cold, impenetrable silence. Do you know how frustrating that is to someone who thrives on chaos? It's like oxygen being cut off. And financially? I started untangling myself from every single thread of dependency she had wrapped around me. Slowly but surely, I removed myself from her grip. I pulled my business contacts back in, explained the lies she had spread, and rebuilt those bridges. I secured housing options outside her reach. And most importantly, I stopped paying her a single dime more than I legally had to. It was like watching a parasite starve. Now, the money part, this was critical. For decades, she had strutted around like a queen. Designer handbags, unnecessary shopping trips, bottles of liquor paraded like trophies. She wanted everyone to think she was wealthy, classy, untouchable. But that lifestyle wasn't real. It was a facade built entirely on my father's paycheck, and on manipulating anyone gullible enough to lend her money. And with my father retired, that paycheck had shrunk. So while I quietly built my independence, she was scrambling. Going to neighbors, crying about health issues, which were lies, begging for help. I didn't have to expose her directly, she was exposing herself. The same people she had manipulated before began to see through her act. When she asked for loans, they hesitated. When she bragged about her wealth, they looked at the bills piling up. Her shine was fading. And I made sure to nudge that process along. Subtly. Patiently. A conversation here, a document there, proof of her lies slipped where it would sting most. It wasn't revenge by explosion. It was revenge by erosion. And it worked beautifully. But my most important move? Protecting my child. After that CPS stunt, I realized how far she was willing to go. She didn't care if it scarred me, she didn't care if it traumatized her own grandchild. If it gave her leverage, she'd do it. So I took steps. I documented everything, the threats, the withheld storage, the false reports. I kept records of every interaction. Because if she ever tried again, I'd be ready. And knowing that I had that shield, it gave me a new kind of strength. For the first time, I didn't feel like a scared kid fighting against my own mother's chaos. I felt like an adult, standing tall, protecting my family. And then came the hardest part. The part one had avoided my whole life. Cutting contact. You'd think it would be easy, after everything she'd done. But walking away from your own mother isn't simple. Society tells you family is forever. Blood is thicker than water. All those cliches drilled into our heads. But here's the truth nobody tells you, blood means nothing when it poisons you. So I cut the strings. No more phone calls. No more texts. No more explaining myself to extended family who acted as her spies. I went no contact. And the silence was deafening. At first, she tried to bait me. Threatening to call the police, threatening to withhold my belongings, threatening to turn more family against me. But when I didn't respond, when I didn't take the bait, her power evaporated. She couldn't control someone who simply refused to play the game. And that's when the unraveling truly began. Her friends? They stopped answering her calls. The neighbors she had convinced to complain about me? They now whispered about her. The family members she had weaponized as spies? They started pulling away when they realized how manipulative she was being. The queen had no kingdom left. And I watched it happen piece by piece. Not with glee, but with a deep, satisfying sense of justice. Because every tantrum, every lie, every cruel scheme she had ever thrown at me, was finally crashing down on her head. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. I just stopped feeding the monster. And without fuel, she destroyed herself. I'll never forget the day it finally sank in for her. We were in the middle of yet another argument, or rather, she was arguing, and I was calm, collected, refusing to take the bait. She screamed about how I was ungrateful, how I owed her everything, how I would regret cutting off my family. And then, I said nothing. Just looked her dead in the eye. Calm. Steady. And walked away. No explosion. No drama. Just silence. And in that silence, I saw it, the flicker of realization in her eyes. The dawning horror that she had finally lost control. That was the moment. The moment she knew she couldn't touch me anymore. And for me? That was sweeter than any screaming match, sweeter than any dramatic revenge. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had won. Walking away from her that day, silent, calm, untouchable, was my personal victory. But life has a funny way of delivering bonus rounds. And my mother? Oh, she had one more lesson to learn. Because karma doesn't just whisper. Sometimes, it roars. Remember how she tried to use the lease agreement against me? After all her manipulations, she had the nerve to stand in front of me, jabbing her finger like a schoolteacher scolding a child, saying, "You'll leave when I say you leave. Not when the contract says." Do you understand me? I remember the rage bubbling up inside. But instead of exploding, I just pulled out the very same contract she had tried to twist against me. Neatly highlighted, notarized, ironclad. And with a calmness that must have terrified her, I said, "Actually, no. I'll leave when this says I leave." Not a second earlier. The look on her face? Priceless. A mixture of fury and panic. Because she suddenly realized I had outsmarted her. The paperwork she thought was her weapon was actually mine. For once in her life, she had no comeback. No lie to wriggle out of it. Just silence. But of course, she couldn't let it go. One evening, she screamed across the apartment that if I didn't leave immediately, she'd call the police. She wanted to scare me, to make me cave. So I smiled. "Call them," I said. Her mouth hung open. Because in that moment, she realized I wasn't afraid anymore. What could she say to them? That her adult child was paying rent legally? That I was abiding by the contract? That I was raising my baby safely while she meddled? The bluff failed. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than losing their ability to scare you. Now, here's where karma decided to step in with a final flourish. See, my mother had spent years building up her queen image in our building. She loved to brag about her supposed wealth, gossip about others, and act like she was above everyone else. But after all the drama with me, the CPS call, the false complaints, the eviction games, people started seeing through the act. Neighbors who once humored her started rolling their eyes when she walked into the room. And then it happened. At a community gathering, a casual barbecue hosted by one of the neighbors, she tried to play her old game. She strutted in, head high, fake pearls swinging, glass of wine in hand, and started running her mouth. Complaining loudly about how ungrateful I was, how I had disrespected family, how I was taking advantage of them. But this time, people didn't nod along. They challenged her. One neighbor, fed up with her theatrics, said, "Funny. Because when CPS came, they said the baby looked perfectly fine. Healthy, even. Care to explain that?" Another chimed in. "And didn't you tell us you were rich? Why are you asking people for money all the time?" The crowd murmured. Questions flew. Her stories unraveled in real time. And for the first time in her life, she didn't have control of the narrative. She stuttered. She deflected. She tried to laugh it off. But the more she spoke, the deeper she dug her hole. People weren't buying it anymore. Her mask, the glamorous, untouchable queen, cracked wide open. And I didn't even have to say a word. And it didn't stop with the neighbors. The relatives she had weaponized against me, the so-called spies she sent to pry into my life, started to notice the pattern too. They realized they were pawns in her game, manipulated into thinking I was the villain. One by one, they stopped answering her calls. Some even reached out to me privately, apologizing for believing her lies. "We see it now," one cousin admitted. "We should have seen it years ago." Do you know how powerful that felt? Not because I needed their validation, I had already built my own strength. But because it meant her empire of manipulation was crumbling from the inside out. The very people she thought she controlled were walking away. The day it all came to a head, I wasn't even there. Apparently, she had one of her signature meltdowns in public, screaming at a cashier for some minor inconvenience, demanding special treatment, waving her hands around like royalty. But this time, the cashier snapped back. Loudly. Firmly. "You can't talk to people like that. You're not special. You're not rich. You're just another customer." And the entire line of people behind her, neighbors, acquaintances, strangers, nodded. Some even laughed. Her face went red. She stormed out. And from that day forward, the whispers started following her instead of me. Not whispers of admiration, but of mockery. Pity. Contempt. The queen was dethroned. Publicly. Permanently. When I heard about it later, I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just smiled. Because I didn't need to destroy her. I didn't need to scream, or humiliate, or orchestrate some dramatic downfall. She had done it all herself. All I had to do was stop feeding her chaos, step back, and let her face the consequences she had been running from her entire life. And in the end, she did. Alone. Powerless. Exposed. Looking back, people often ask me, was it worth it? Was the revenge satisfying? And my answer is simple, yes. But not because she suffered, though watching her lies collapse was undeniably sweet. It was satisfying because I reclaimed my power. Because I broke the cycle. Because my child will grow up in a world where manipulation and cruelty are not normal. Revenge isn't always about fire and fury. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is building a life so strong, so peaceful, so untouchable, that your enemies collapse under the weight of their own lies. That's what I did. And I'll never regret it. Narrator pause, final direct address to audience. And to anyone listening who's ever dealt with a toxic parent, a manipulative family member, or someone who thrived on your pain, remember this: the moment you stop giving them power, they lose everything. And sometimes, karma handles the rest. Justice doesn't always look like a courtroom drama. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it looks like walking away. And sometimes, it looks like your abuser finally drowning in the lies they built for themselves. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.